Muy buenos días a todas y a todas, pero por ser norteamericana voy a hablar en inglés. Voy a abordar en 15 minutos, como mi promesa a mi querido Alejo, lo que enseño en 15 semanas. Será un desafío. It's wonderful to be back in Panama, where many of you know I used to live. It's my second home. I need to thank Congressman Pittenger, President Jacobo, and my colleagues from Crime Stoppers for inviting me to share my latest research and information regarding trends that we're seeing in transnational organized crime. But first, I think we should take a moment to recognize today, a year ago today, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that we should think and keep those who are fighting the fight for democracy in our thoughts and prayers, and recognize that this is actually something that affects all of us around the world. So that's why I'm wearing yellow today with my little flag, and this afternoon I understand we'll be commemorating at the museum the one-year anniversary, or the one-year mark of that invasion. So let's begin. Siguiente, por favor. Okay. I don't think there's a... Aquí? Okay. Yeah. Oh. So if you think about the world we live in today, over the last 30 years, we as citizens, global citizens, have enjoyed access to goods, services, information in a faster, better way because of a more integrated world. But at the same time, unfortunately, the dark side of globalization, that is the illicit economy, has expanded. There's not a day that goes by around the world that we don't hear about the trafficking of drugs, arms, contraband, and people. And we've seen, particularly during COVID-19, that this illicit economy expanded even faster due to the crisis that all of our economies were experiencing. But why is Latin America and the Caribbean more subject to transnational organized crime and insecurity? It has a lot to do with the environment that we live in. And unfortunately, as has been mentioned by many speakers, corruption lies at the heart of it. It's not armed groups, it's not mafias, it's not gangs. All of those groups live off of a corrupt environment. And unfortunately, too, we've seen that weak institutions that have been co-opted by armed groups and illegal movements, have also suffered and struggled to maintain law and order around the region. And what has this done? It's contributed to what we call citizen insecurity. If we take a look at all of the elections that have taken place in the last few years in the region, the two top issues are insecurity and the lack of economic opportunity. And that's what we've seen, this level of inequality. While Latin America and the Caribbean are very blessed with so many natural and human resources, we've also seen, unfortunately, that inequality in every one of our countries. And what's taking place here is that illicit networks that include insurgencies, terrorists, criminal networks, and their facilitators take advantage of this challenging environment to promote their nefarious agendas, whether they be politically motivated or, in the case of crime, motivated by greed. We also have seen, and my colleague Joseph will speak to this, the role of external actors that include China, Russia, Iran, and the United States in terms of looking at what's going on in the region. And unfortunately, as we've seen, the region is very susceptible to natural disasters, whether they be hurricanes or earthquakes or extreme weather. What has happened and why we consider this region the most volatile and the most subjected to transnational organized crime are the immense number of victims. Latin America, despite having no actual war taking place, has year on year had the highest homicide rates per 100,000. And sadly, the situation is getting worse. When we take a look at this insecurity, and more importantly, the homicide rate that also takes place here in Panama, a lot of it is linked to narco-trafficking, which tends to be and continues to be the #1 most lucrative illicit activity in the world. And here you can see, as was mentioned by Minister Pino, we're looking at a kilo of cocaine that costs $48,000 in the United States, costing $100,000 in Europe, and 180,000 in Australia. That's why we've seen the globalization of drug trafficking. Why is this? Because cocaine, for example, is a substance that doesn't expire compared to vegetables or cheese or milk. And that's why it can circumnavigate the world and wait to find vulnerable ports to access, and more importantly, to even profit more from faraway markets that didn't exist maybe 10 years ago. There's a different phenomenon that's really disturbing that we're starting to see, is the movement from plant-based drugs like heroin, marijuana, and cocaine to synthetic drugs. These drugs don't need to depend on farmers, on environments, or cultivation. It just skips that whole phase and depends on laboratories and precursor chemicals. In the United States, we're suffering an opioid epidemic, consuming so much more fentanyl and methamphetamine. Even though we've seen this change, it's something that's going to come to your countries. So for those who don't know, fentanyl is a deadly drug. It actually has legitimate use, but only a few grains, not grams, grains can kill you. It comes from China, and it can be mixed in any different format. It's usually made into a pill. And just to give you the mathematics behind this, it costs 16 cents in Mexico for the cartels to produce one little pill, and they can sell that pill for $6 on the streets of the US, which makes it extremely accessible for young people in the US. Everyone has $6 to consume it. And the bigger problem is it's looking for ways to flow and come to our hemisphere. So it flows through right now Mexico, and we now have some indications that the Mexican cartels are actually moving and exchanging fentanyl pills for cocaine. So we've seen this in Colombia. What has happened, though, is last year in the United States, over 108,000 Americans died of fentanyl overdoses, and that number is increasing ever more. We're worried that that is going to now spread to other places. Why? Because it's all about the money. And more importantly, you could just create laboratories anywhere. The other piece that accompanies this whole issue of transnational crime are illicit financial flows. And I know we've had many panels looking at illicit financing, but I wanted to make the connection, and more importantly, how this crime is growing and expanding, especially in what we call the digital age. According to the UN, we divide illicit financial flows in 3 categories. The first one is actual straight-out corruption or tax evasion. The second one is the income that we generate through illicit activities like transnational organized crime. And the third one is what we use that money for. So we can use it for maintaining a cartel or a mafia, or to actually carry out terrorist groups that we've sadly seen take place around the world. Now, there are many ways that we can launder money. Banks are still very popular, physical cash, but now we're starting to see new ways that these groups are taking advantage. As we saw this morning on the crypto, it's more abusing financial instruments and services in order to support crime, and that's something that we're very worried about. When we take a look particularly at rogue states, we're starting to see an increased use of cryptocurrencies to evade sanctions. And this is in the case of Russia. Today, my government will impose even more new sanctions against Putin's regime. But we've seen how the Russians have been very adept at evading sanctions, using, for example, cryptocurrencies. The same is true with Venezuela, North Korea, and Iran. But we've also seen a lot of criminals have taken their business into the internet and are also accepting all these payments through cryptocurrencies. One example, and I'm about to go to Mexico in 2 weeks to go and take a look at this. The cartels are starting to pay young people, 18 to 20 years old, money to open a virtual wallet in their real name, and then they're going to use those virtual wallets in the name of these young people to start to bring dollars from the US that come from drug trafficking, and then download that money into Mexican pesos, avoiding detection and avoiding what we call capital controls. If I go to Mexico, I can only exchange $400 a day into Mexican pesos, but no one's watching. So they're called cyber smurfs. I think it's a very interesting name of people who are, small people who are using their accounts, but now in the cyber domain. So what are we doing in order to combat transnational organized crime? We have many efforts at the international level through the UN. We have regional efforts through the OAS. And I wanted to share with you what we're doing from the point of view of the American government. So in the US, for over 10 years, we've had a countering transnational organized crime strategy that focused a lot on illicit trafficking. And now what we've added, which are new under the Biden administration, is a standalone strategy to counter corruption, recognizing that corruption is literally the oxygen that feeds these groups. And then in our national security strategy, for the first time, that was published in October, we've included transnational organized crime and corruption as standalone threats to US national security, that then also tie into the foreign assistance that we give countries such as Panama and many of your countries in order to internationalize the fight against transnational organized crime. What we've also seen, and I think it was very interesting to see Minister Pino, how do different countries work together? So the United States leads a joint interagency task force in Key West, Florida, that Admiral Fears was the leader of for many years, where we combine gathering that intelligence from his cycle of success, actually putting together joint operations, and more importantly, being able to communicate what are the latest trends that are taking place. We've also started to more deliberately follow the money trail, and this has to do with complementing what we call law enforcement and counter-narcotics operations with following the money. Since the objective of these criminal organizations is to maximize their profits, the money is actually also the oxygen that feeds them. And we've been very, very successful in dismantling many networks, because it's harder to replace the accountant than it is to replace all of those soldiers that are part of your cartel or your gang or your terrorist group. What we've seen, though, in the past couple of years, and I think it's becoming even more accentuated, is that Latin America and the Caribbean have now become the theater for what we call great power competition, with an increased aggressive presence of China and Russia in order to counterbalance the US. One specific example has a lot to do with an area that I focus on a lot. I mentioned already the plague of fentanyl, but we're starting to see China use what we call the asymmetrical warfare that the ambassador alluded to earlier this morning, but through the drug trade. The Chinese are making money by exporting fentanyl and the precursor chemicals that go to the laboratories in Mexico, but they're also becoming the #1 money launderer for US dollars for the Mexican cartels, because the Chinese need hard currency. So they make money from exporting the actual components of the drugs, and they charge 1% to 2% to launder the money that they need in terms of hard currency dollars to basically aggressively invest in other parts of the world, including the United States. What we've seen too, in terms of emerging trends, is just as how we are all digital citizens, we've seen how illicit networks are co-opting cyberspace. They're expanding and making parallel markets in cyberspace. So for example, from my apartment in Washington, DC, I can, through the internet, order my synthetic drugs and pay with a cryptocurrency. Then it's mailed to my house. So it's very interesting. Everything that used to be done in person is now being done online. The same is true in terms of all types of other activities. And sadly, social media has become the vehicle to project and multiply the ability of illicit networks to touch our children and to expand their networks, whether it's through recruitment or, more importantly, offering online drugs in terms of markets, advertising how much a coyote, a human trafficker, will charge is something very disturbing that we're starting to see, and the proliferation of child pornography, a heinous crime, but we're seeing even more of it of Latino and Caribbean children than ever before. We've also seen how they use the internet as well as the cyberspace to launder money and move money and finance terrorism. And you've all seen in the last couple of years the massive protests that have been motivated throughout Latin America linked to political movements that are creating instability around the world. Just a very specific example that we use in the US, on your left side, you'll see a little poster. These are little emojis. Some of you use them in WhatsApp, right? Smiley face or a thumbs up. These are emojis of drugs. It would be a child, an adolescent, maybe 12 years old, using an emoji to order drugs on WhatsApp, and the quantity. They don't even use words. So the DEA put this poster together to socialize and raise awareness among parents, teachers, and kids to be aware that this is the language of online drug trafficking. And sadly, it's proliferating all around the world as well. So this is the new reality. We have this concept of the cyber-physical world, where all the activities, licit or illicit, that take place in human to human and in a physical space are now being copied in cyberspace. And unfortunately, we don't have enough eyes and ears to monitor and detect. And this is actually why, when we're looking at countering emerging threats from illicit networks, we need to modernize the way that we use the military and intelligence agencies to detect what's going on, new trends. We also have to educate our law enforcement agents to understand who's involved in this new digital illicit economy, and then how we can sanction and follow the money, the virtual money, that may not be so obvious. And this is where training is so important. And this question about how do we protect the cyber domain is quite critical. So just because a lot of this activity takes place in the private sector, public-private partnership is even more important than ever before. And the other thing is, as we know in many of our countries, all of this drug trafficking and human trafficking exists because of demand. And this is where we need the civic sector, whether it's academic institutions, religious institutions, they have to get involved as well, because everyone is now responsible for national security. And this is where we talk about we have to communicate, cooperate, and collaborate. And if we could use social media to actually raise awareness, which is what the DEA has been doing with this poster of one pill can kill, people are much more attuned to what could be happening and how our children could be at risk. So with that, you have my information there. Thank you so much for the opportunity, for this opportunity to share with you what we're really seeing, that as the digital age helps us communicate, there is a dark side of this globalization at the same time. Thank you.